we're excited to kind of share with you a little bit about our experience with the tornado that happened in Parkersburg in 2008. And the way that this will work is we are going to divide the presentation up into two parts. The first part being kind of just the story of what happened, how we responded to the tornado, what types of things were put in place, and then a little bit of what we wish we would have known, how we would have liked to have handled it if we could have a redo button. And then the second part of the presentation will focus a little bit more on specifically trauma-related things, so dealing more with trauma in your students, in the parents, in the community, and that type of stuff. So as Britt said, if you have questions, we would love to answer those at the end. So if, as we speak, just go ahead and type those in, and we'll try to answer them as best that we can towards the end. So this very first slide is a picture of, well, just the devastation. This actually was a neighborhood, and there were several houses in that area, and as you can see, there's just nothing left. So, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So this is kind of what you drove into if you were driving down Highway 57 on the evening of May 25th, or the next day, actually. So let's see if we can get this.
I remember it was kind of interesting if you were coming from the Cedar Falls side, this is what you'd see, but if you came from the Aplington side, you'd come into town and it looked fine for a while, and then boom, you'd see that line where the destruction was. Everything looked normal, and
then not so normal.
Yeah. It's strange.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so the tornado actually happened on Memorial Day weekend, which was sort of, if you'll pardon the perfect storm. There was a beautiful, beautiful day, gorgeous, gorgeous outside. People were grilling, they were playing outside. There were tons of high school graduation parties going on. So what ended up happening, the reason we're saying this is because people were really just outside in their t-shirts and shorts and flip-flops, really not really preparing to know that tomorrow that might be all that they had. They rushed to their shelter, when the sirens sounded. And as the slide says, the tornado that we experienced they're guessing it lasted right around 45 seconds, so less than a minute. And in that little amount of time, houses were completely destroyed. As you know, the high school was torn apart. Lots of businesses were damaged. I know, like the elementary school was not ruined, but needed several new windows and new parts of the roof. Our entire playground was ruined. There was glass all over. There was not, you could not walk on any type of lawn, without shoes for fear of, being injured. And 7 people actually lost their lives. And I do believe, although I don't want to be quoted here, I do think that those people were not in any basement of any kind. I think that they were.
I think some of the people that died were like elderly, and it was like heart-related kind of.
Yeah, and I think that those were mostly like they didn't have like a real safe spot to go to, so there was a couple that those. So the people that could get to a safe spot like a basement, I think were mostly were okay.
Yeah.
We don't know for sure.
It was about a third of the town. About a third of the town was.
Yeah, so it was a big group of people. So as you know, it lasted about a minute, and neither Kathy nor I were actually there at the time that it happened. We don't live there, which kind of turned out to be a blessing in this case.
Yeah.
But as we've heard from many people, as soon, and small town, big town, I think this would happen anyway, people rushed to the assistance of their neighbors and friends. There were people trapped in all different places. There were people that were in freezers and closets and bathtubs, and we've heard stories under stairways, and I mean, just the strangest places. And you have to remember, you know, people are doing this just initially. This is just they're in survival mode. They're just putting themselves in harm's way to make sure their friends and neighbors are okay. And Kathy may touch on this a little bit more when we're talking about the trauma piece of it. But in doing some of that helping, you know, they're also really putting themselves out there to kind of see and do and be part of the traumatized brain,
Yeah.
wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Also, people from Aplington, their homes were not demolished the way they were in Parkersburg. They had storms, but they came quickly to the aid of Parkersburg, as I understand. It was also a safety issue because there were a lot of dangerous things, like from the stories we were told, the whole town smelled like gas initially. There was just the smell of gas in the air, and there was this real concern.
In fact, it was evacuated
right away.
Leave that night.
That night,
even if their house was not hit, people had to leave town because of that.
Yeah, because they didn't know where any of that stuff. I mean, you couldn't see, and by that time it's dark. And so there was a lot of really dangerous stuff with just the gas and power lines, and you know, obviously there's no electricity, no water. And so what ended up happening was, and it says the emergency center was set up at the Vets building. Well, this is kind of two-part. We had one sort of emergency center set up at the Vets building in Parkersburg, which was just down the road. And then there was also kind of the true emergency center was set up in Aplington at the school. And that's where all the donations were being taken and that type of thing.
There was places for people to sleep was actually in Aplington. The Vets building in Parkersburg had that was more like for a daytime place to go for meals and to take a break and cool down and things like that.
The other thing that Vets building sort of served as was kind of a place to find information out, communication center, and we'll be talking a little bit about that in the next couple of slides. And one of the things that we, in hanging out, so to speak, at the Vets building, we quickly realized that there needed to be somewhere for children and kids to go, because that was the one thing that we noticed right away is, well, what's going on with the kids? What's happening to them? So as school counselors, how did we respond at the very beginning? I think the biggest thing that we did was we were there. I was actually out of town. I was in Chicago that weekend, and I remember I was getting phone calls like crazy. My sister's like, you need to go home tomorrow because your phone's not going to quit ringing. So I was actually driving home the next Monday, and the first chance I had to be in Parkersburg was Tuesday morning. Kathy, you were there right away Monday morning, I think, weren't you?
Yeah.
So you can kind of talk about what you did.
Well, you know, the first thing I called and said, I'm coming over, what do you need? And actually, I didn't get into Parkersburg. My building was in Aplington, and that's where the center was for recovery center or whatever. And so I called and said, I'm coming over, what do you need? And was kind of, we'll talk about that in a little while, kind of what the requests for what they needed. But I didn't actually get into Parkersburg until, I'll bet it was probably Tuesday, maybe even Wednesday morning, because they were, of course, trying to keep people out of there, and I didn't even try to go in. I didn't want to add to the confusion and the more people and more traffic and whatnot, and I didn't need to be in there. So I drove around Parkersburg to get to Aplington. And she was talking, the screen talks about being visible, and Kara mentioned that. And I think you kind of, as counselors, you kind of have this vision of yourself, being in your office and having floods of people coming in, and for the first week or so, you really didn't do any counseling at all. You did what everybody else did, which was, like she said, being visible, helping in every place that everybody else was helping, and just being out there and talking to people and finding out what was going on and who was where and what had happened, and just communicating with people, just being visible.
Mm-hmm. And a little bit about the Children's Center that we set up. In talking with a lot of people, one of the things that had happened, since it was a holiday weekend, there were also a lot of families that were gone. So they came back to their homes being destroyed, or their neighbors, or their siblings, or whoever, their family members. So although they were not here at the time, they came back to this big mess. And of course the parents, they want to pitch in, they want to help, they want to do everything they can for their friends and family. But then, they have their 8 and 10-year-old there too that are just kind of dumbfounded with what do we do with the kids. So it happened so quickly. It happened over the course of a couple days. We ended up talking with a couple parents who had sort of a teen center place for kids to kind of hang out on the weekends, and they basically gave us the keys and said, do whatever you want with that place. So what we did is we just kind of printed up some flyers that said, if your kids are between the ages of this and this, bring them during these hours. If they're between these ages, bring them at this time. And what that did, we thought, doing that, I don't know if I'll speak for you, sorry, I thought that, it was going to be a time of get into that counseling and hear their stories and find out, what happened and help them feel better. And what happened was they got to hang out with their friends and they got to play, and they didn't really want to talk about the tornado, but they got to make sure their friends were okay, and they got to ask about what they were doing, Memorial Day weekend, and what camps they're going to go to, and life kind of was a little normal for them for those couple of hours. So
there were some kids that would talk about
right away
their problems, but most of them, like you said, just preferred to have a little normalcy.
Right.
And
I think that as that went on, I mean, we were there the whole month of June that center was there. So we were pretty much there for the kids the whole month of June. And as the summer went on, towards the end of June, kids really did start to talk a little bit more about their experiences. But that first part, they just wanted to be kids.
Well, and also when we first got there, there was still communication issues, and a lot of kids who didn't know where their friends were, they were worried about it. And there were families who had relocated, and we didn't know where a lot of people were. So that was a lot of it, was just seeing that their friends were okay, and finding out where they were staying, and making those connections and communicating. That was a lot of it the first week or so.
Okay, so what we did is we are going to go through just a few of things that we learned in this experience. And there were several things that we probably would have done again. I think that Children's Center would be one of the biggest things I would encourage to do. But there are lots of things we wish we would have had in place. And from talking with lots of coworkers and also colleagues, it sounds like it's always sounds like a good idea, but how many of us really have that plan? So
yeah,
we did learn that although sometimes it's hard to be a consolidated school district with 2 towns and all the craziness of busing and everything, it's very nice to have one combined district with another town that we could go to in something like this. But in determining what our crisis response plan would be, it also became clear that things would have been a little different had it happened in the other town. So if you're in a consolidated district and you're thinking about what that crisis plan would look like, I think that it'd be important to think about what is town A going to need and what is town B going to need, because chances are it might affect a little bit of how you plan that.
But it can be an advantage, a big advantage,
yeah,
to having those 2 locations, so you can plan for if it happened here, you go there, and if it happened there, you go here.
Exactly.
So.
One of the biggest things that was a problem at the beginning was communication. I think it became really clear really fast that we rely very heavily on our cell phones and our telephones even, and the internet. And when a town's entire internet is down, people just did not know what to do. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, we just kind of had the sense of, well, where's the web page?
Yeah. And when people aren't even physically in the location you can find them, or they don't have a card to get to where it's just really difficult to communicate.
And it was something that I had never really thought of in
No.
terms of like, how are we going to really communicate? So what happens is you kind of go back to basics, and community buildings became the communication hubs. So typically churches, schools, like we used Aplington School, were used. They had a lot of town meetings where they would kind of say, okay, this is what we're going to have the power guys here on this day, and the water people are going to be here in this, and everybody needs to have, if you want anything to be taken away, the garbage people are going to come in on these days. And I mean, it was just crazy, all the logistics that went in to some of these little housekeeping announcement types of things.
And those meetings were so important, and you had to get the information out about those meetings,
Yeah, how do you let people know about those meetings when you have no way to get
posting? At those centers, like at the vets building and at the school, you have bulletin board place where everybody would check for announcements and postings there, and word of mouth too. When it's a small community, that helps. But it was tough. It was challenging. No sending notes home with kids from school.
I know.
So it was
a big challenge. Had we had a chance to do it over again, we have all talked about how it would be nice to have an alternative website set up, ready to go in case of any kind of emergency or crisis. So obviously our whole school website and server was down for what felt like forever.
Yeah, it did.
But it would have been really nice to have, even in maybe a neighboring district or somebody, just post a website, even as simple as a Google site, that we could access to just let people know these are some announcements, and these are some of the things that you can find out.
So if you're in a small district, or it doesn't matter what size district, you have when you come up with your crisis plan, that there's several schools that go together, and you would advertise your plan ahead of time and let people know that if your website is down, this is our alternative website, and that's where you go for information. So you just have that planned ahead of time. That would have helped a great deal.
It also would have really helped in terms of telephone communication, because the phone lines were just swamped in a good way. Also in a frustrating way, people were calling because they needed information for themselves, like, where can I get this, or we need this, or have you heard what to do in this situation?
Yeah.
But then they were also swamped with people calling from, the whole state of Iowa, basically, and saying, our church wants to bring 5 vans of clothes to you. Where do we put them? And our school wants to donate, this to you guys, and where do we do with it? And so that became, it was something that was amazing, the outpouring of support, but it also became a logistical kind of a nightmare, because it was really hard to organize and very hard to get all of that information through just the telephone. So if you had somewhere on a website where somebody was kind of monitoring those types of requests and those types of donation types of things, that would be really helpful too. Yeah. Do you want to talk about the context a little bit, kind of what happened with your office?
I'm not remembering what.
Well, one of the things we talked about that we also
the volunteer thing
was, we had another blessing that was really difficult, was that we had so many people say, we want to come and help. We have such a great network of school counselors, and we had just both of our phones were ringing crazy from people saying, we want to come and help, and we want to be there, and we want to do anything we can.
Hundreds and hundreds of emails.
But what ended up happening was, this was really difficult for us to screen the ones that we didn't know, and it was also very hard to kind of keep a list of who have we talked to, who did we say we called back, who did we say, yes, come over, who did we just got very I just got very, I'm
We-
talking for
we all
Kathy.
did. No, it's,
I felt very overwhelmed with, oh my gosh, I don't even know who I've talked to anymore. I don't know which direction I'm even going in this. So one of the things that Kathy and I talked about was sort of preparing a list of pre-screened contacts. So for example, maybe having a list of like 50 people that you've talked to or 20 people that you've talked to that would be willing to help out in any kind of situation. And it would be twofold, you would agree to help them too. And then that way and you'll have all these contacts listed, and then that way when something does happen, you kind of are the one with the go button. So you can send out one email to this list and say, okay, we need help. Please respond to this email if you can, at this email address, maybe a different email address. And then those specific people can communicate with you. And anybody extra that maybe you don't know or you haven't heard, you don't know a lot about, hasn't been screened, any of those extra things you can kind of, say to them, well, we already have some.
have an auto reply ready to go. And
say, we've already gotten some volunteers. Thank you for, your input. We will contact you if we need more. But then that way I think it would save you a lot of time and just some of those, I don't know, just the monitoring of the volunteers.
And your plan would be, you would be probably on those people's list as well to help them in an emergency, and just have that all prepared and ready. Yeah.
One of the big learnings for us was that it's very important, as we always know, to not assume anything. We assumed that I assumed that there would be a lot of mental health support available. Yeah. We had a really difficult time communicating with the Red Cross, and we had some miscommunication as far as who is appropriate to do some counseling, who is needed, if they're going to come in and take over, if we are qualified to do it. So some of those things got to be a little bit touchy as far as who is going to take care of our town, kind of. Don't you think?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it was a good 2 weeks before the Red Cross brought anybody for any kind of mental health support to begin with. Anyway, just don't make those assumptions, and know that you're going to have to really advocate for your families and your students. And just don't back down on that. That you know your
needs.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you know your families. A learning for me was, I guess maybe it shouldn't have been, but I just really didn't think about the kind of things that would be needed for donations, and the kind of things, when you realize that a lot of those people, like I think Kara mentioned earlier, they're out, grilling in their flip-flops and their shorts, and you think about it, that's all they got out with, that's all they had. And so, the first time I came over and called and said, what do you need? I was just, shocked at the kind of needs that they had, and like toothbrushes and underwear and feminine hygiene products, and so there's needs for everything, every kind of thing in the world you can imagine, and that goes on. That goes on for a long time, way into the first snowfall. All those people that lost their homes didn't have coats. The kids didn't have coats or mittens or boots or snow shovels, or
And that happened the whole entire year. As things came up, it dawned on them.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, we don't have that.
And
oh my gosh.
A long time after the big, beginning when it first happened, there were lots of donations. But when it got into the winter, people pretty much had forgotten about all those people and the donations needed.
And that would be something too, if you are, maybe something doesn't happen in your district, but you as district would like to help out a neighboring town that did, or somebody else in the state. This would be one of those learnings that I think I took away was, how can we help out later? They're going to be swamped with things the first month, 2 months. How can we as a school help out in 6 months when the rest of the world has kind of gone on with their life, but we still are kind of dealing with this. So that's something that I've tried to remember too. And I think I touched on this one already, that the assumption that people are going to need some crisis counseling right away. Kathy's going to talk about this here pretty quickly, but people are in survival mode there for the first part of the while. I thought maybe a day or two, but this goes on for probably months, and then things start to settle down, and as you'll find out, the trauma piece of it and the crisis counseling and working through things will continue for the next probably years, of their life. So just a few little tips that we will go through, and we've already talked about most of these, but being visible. So going to those town meetings if they come up, working at volunteer stations, even if you are unpacking crates of water and doing all this physical labor and you feel like you're not counseling, it is counseling. It is what you were supposed to be doing. Talk and talk and talk and listen and listen and listen to as many people as possible. Sometimes those stories just crop up when you are unpacking water or when you are, serving food, and people are not going to be thinking like they're sitting there getting counseling, but yet, talking sometimes comes out in those ways.
This is a big one, and I got trauma training and knew all about all the signs and helped a lot of people, and yet found myself driving back and forth to work for a good 3 weeks before, and crying going to work and crying coming home before I recognized that, oh, gee, maybe I have a little post-traumatic stress. So you gotta be able to recognize those signs in yourself, and I think sometimes you just can't. You're just too buried in it, and so you need to ask for help from your peers and help each other, and make sure that you let each other know when you're seeing something of concern in your peers and coworkers. So just look out for each other, and when you see something or feel something, get help. Get some counseling. It does, it's our profession, but it seems like I know a lot of counselors that don't do it for themselves. So,
well, even if we weren't there, that was the part that kind of surprised me, that I didn't have to be present during that tornado. I didn't have to run to a basement, and yet, well, I was telling Kathy this story last spring. I was at my parents' house. The tornado sirens went off. My toddler was sleeping in the back bedroom. It was 11 o'clock at night, and I think I had him out of the crib and in the basement in about 10 seconds. And I told Kathy, I said, oh, wow, it's in there. It's in that brainstem. So, hearing stories and working through things with other kids, it probably will affect you. This would have been a big learning for me. I wish I would have gotten trauma training before a crisis occurred. I think I kind of, you assume that you get the training that you need when you're in your grad classes, which you do. However, trauma training is something what I have learned is it almost went against what natural counseling instinct told me. And so what I learned through the trauma stuff, and I would like to get more. Kathy's more knowledgeable in that area, but I wish I would have had more of that training before instead of after. And then I think you'll talk a little bit more about this part, but it also doesn't take things like a natural disaster to result in trauma. And this is the piece that I wish I would have realized, because I think that trauma training, I should probably do that. That'd be a good idea. That'd be a good idea to have that tornado box prepared in my own personal basement too, but I'll get around to it. But if somebody had told me, you deal with traumatized kids every day, I think I would have been more likely to get some trauma training, and learning that things like parent divorce, which I deal with every day, and having parents incarcerated or dealing with alcohol abuse or domestic violence, neglect, any types of these things, they can be traumatizing in kids, and can result in kind of the same types of behaviors and things. So
a lot of ADHD is
trauma related.
Yeah.
And that is our segue to part two.
Good lead in. So
I'm trying to watch the clock a little bit.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about. And I'll tell you right now that I put a lot of the slides in the second part as information for you. I'm going to skip a lot of it, kind of plow through it. But I put it in here specifically so you would have the information. So later, go back and look over it and read through some of it. But I won't be going through each and every piece of it. But I wanted you to have the information. So why is it important? I guess that'd be my big message, and Kara kind of just said it, which is basically, you all need this. It's not, most of you hopefully will not go through what we went through, or any other kind of big disaster or murder or any of those things that we've been through. But trauma, you guys deal with trauma every day, with all the things that Kara mentioned. All of the kids that we work with, all of the school districts that you're in have kids that have trauma. So that's why it's important. So look at the first item under the research. That it says there's strong correlation between trauma and low academic achievement, and that alone right there, you can use that as your argument when you go in and tell your principal you want to go to a trauma training, because that's, low academic achievement is a big concern in every school and every administrator. That's important. So and the next one talks about how natural disaster and the things that we went through are and single incidents of distress and can traumatize a child, but the chronic stress of family or community violence or abuse, that's the long-lasting effect, on a kid's brain, and that is the stuff that you guys all deal with every day in school when you're counseling kids. So, that's the really heavy-duty stuff that we're talking about. So that's why you guys really need trauma training, and why it will be worthwhile for you to, nothing's happening here. I'm trying to change slides and it's not going anywhere. Oh, great.
That's true.
Thank you. Okay. So here's some of the benefits of being trauma informed. And like I said, when you're trying to sell this to your principal, this is sell the getting trauma training. This is how you do it. Improved academic achievement and test scores. This is research-based information. It reduces dropouts. It reduces behavior outbursts and problems, referrals to the office. It increases reduces absences and detentions and suspensions and all that. And obviously, all those things are going to improve climate, school climate. It reduces stress on staff and students, and that's going to improve the environment, the school environment, and teachers are going to be more satisfied, and going to retain those new teachers, and reduction in bullying and harassment, and that's all of us are working on. So that's important, and reduction in need for special ed. So those are all things that all of us, all of our school improvement plans I'm sure have all of those things in it. And
I think that one of the reasons, if I jump in real quickly, is that when we were talking with our staff and our teachers about some of this stuff and how to respond to kids, and you can just tell that some of their reactions were just completely surprised that that dealing with kids in a certain way, could be even more harmful to them. And I think that they just really honestly, and by no fault of their own, just hadn't even realized it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why, when you have a staff that is really cognizant of how trauma and dealing with traumatized students, and even parents too, I think that's why those things in that previous slide can be changed because of that.
Yeah. Yep. All things we're working for. So let's talk about trauma and what it is. Definition of trauma is a feeling of being totally unsafe and powerless to do anything to change it. And most of us, we don't really we may feel unsafe sometimes, but we know what to do to feel better. We're able to control that. But if you think about that, there's not many times in our lives that we feel that way. think about what counts as trauma for a child. And the reason I bring this up is that, you know, it's important that you look at it from the child's perspective, what they perceive, because it could be, you know, to a kid, it could be a monster in the closet. You know, now we know there's no monster in the closet, but if that kid is seriously terrified and thinks that that monster in the closet is real, they truly could be, you know, post-traumatic from the monster in the closet. So you got
their reality.
Yeah, it's their reality. So that's really important to know. Now, down below, there's some more obvious and realistic maybe examples of that. But these are all things that you know, very possibly have had, or some of them definitely have worked with kids in school, that, you know, the divorce and separation of parents, and, you know, accidents, bad storms, natural disasters, witnessing violence, all those things. You know, there's a list, and there's plenty more that we could put on that list. Those are all things that can cause trauma. So there are all things you could be dealing with kids on. This is just part of a handout that came from the website at the bottom of the screen there. That is from the place from TLC, which is where I went to get my training in Michigan. And that website has tons of great information about trauma, and I really urge you to go there and investigate. There's great articles, research, handouts for parents, information for teachers and counselors, all kinds of stuff, and it gets better every day. Lots of information there. This is a grief compared to trauma thing, and the reason I put this up here was because that was one of my, you know, misunderstandings. I really thought that grief and trauma were pretty much the same thing, and they're not, and they're easily confused. So, like for instance, you know, when you have a kid in your office and you're trying to figure out whether it's grief that they're dealing with or trauma, this will help you to keep the two, tell the two apart. So, for instance, you know, if the kid's having bad dreams, you know, it tells you here that if they're dreaming about the person who died, then that would be a grief dream. Whereas if they're having dreams about themselves, you know, scary dreams about themselves dying or being in danger, then that would be a trauma dream. Okay, this is really important part. This is a physiology of trauma, and this is really what makes what it's all about, and why it's important. The thing that I really learned about trauma at the training was that the normal things that we do as counselors with kids, if they're traumatized, are not going to work. And it's because of basically what you see on this page. It talks about 3 parts of the brain. You know, the brain stem, which just deals with the basic body functions like breathing and those kind of things. The limbic part of the brain, which is the emotional brain. And that's where the fight or flight reactions happen, sensations. And it has what they call the implicit memory, which is kind of the unconscious memory. And then the third part is the cortex or the neocortex, which is the thinking brain or the language part, and that's the explicit memory. And this is where, you know, most of the time where we're working out of our brain, and where our memory generally is, and that's why most of our counseling, you know, when we do, you know, talk therapy, I guess you'd call it, makes sense, because that's where the memory and our language is located. But during a crisis, what happens is, you know, when you're being traumatized or you're in terror, we downshift into that limbic area, and we're just basically just reacting on instinct, that fight or flight. So when you're afraid for your life, you are just reacting. And that's why the fight or flight, you're afraid for your life, so you're either going to run or freeze, you know, out of terror, or you're going to fight back to protect yourself. And so the memory of a traumatized person is in that implicit memory, that unconscious memory, and it's sometimes they call it a body memory. It's not that they don't remember the incident themselves. There is, of course, the explicit memory. They can go in and sit to a counseling session, sit down and talk about the memory and tell you what happened the day of the tornado or the whatever happened. They can tell you from the beginning to the end what happened, but they don't remember the trauma part, the terror part, the sensory part of it when they tell you that story. So that's not going to get them past the traumatic part of it. So it's really important for us as educators to remember that the sensory memory, the traumatic part of the memory, is not remembered in the language part of our brain. It's remembered in the sensory part, in the limbic part of the brain, and that's why the talk therapy part isn't going to do anything to get rid of that. So what happens in post-traumatic stress is that sometimes, remember that that's the part of the brain that you're in when the trauma happens. And what happens is sometimes in cases of post-traumatic stress, what happens is that they get kind of stuck in that part of the brain, and that never gets fully resolved. And so they're kind of just stuck back in that sensory part of the brain. And they can actually see this on PET scans. It's actually the brain chemistry actually changes in the brain, and they can see that on a PET scan. So let's talk about some of the myths. This was a big learning for me, and I think most people. There's a lot of myths, and we heard a lot of people, obviously parents and teachers and ourselves too, that believe these myths. One myth is that, I think Kara said something about this one earlier, the myth of proximity or severity, that that if your house was hit by the tornado or you were there when it happened, that you're more likely to be, you're going to be more traumatized or more likely to be traumatized than the people that weren't there, or that it didn't happen to their house. Not true. Proximity has really nothing to do with whether or not you'll be post-traumatic, or how severely you were affected. It was affected physically. It says, in fact, they don't need to be physically affected at all to be post-traumatic. Another one is the myth of immediacy, meaning that we heard people say, like when a student would start having problems all of a sudden, and 6 months after or a year after, and the parents would say, well, it couldn't be post-trauma. It's been a year. They would have been fine all along up until now. But that is a myth also. All the research shows that the peak mental health period, our mental health need period following a crisis or a trauma is 18 to 24 months afterwards. The peak need. So some people, don't even start showing problems for that long afterwards.
And Kathy, if I can interrupt you, if we look at the students at the Parkersburg elementary building, it was almost, I would say, clockwork. Like if we went from the time of the tornado, it was almost exactly 2 years later. It was during that second year where we really started to see a lot of behavior issues. We started to see a lot of acting out. And it kind of dawned on us, like, wait a minute.
Wow.
This is exactly what the research said.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
So it really, really was a huge surprise for me.
Yeah. We knew this stuff going in, but we really, and it was just, wow. It's just like the research said. I'm going to skip over a lot of this because I want to make sure we have time for questions, and I want to get through to the what do you do about it. But fact is, there's a lot. It has to do, who's vulnerable really has to do with where they're at emotionally beforehand. Is, if you're in a vulnerable state for any reason beforehand, you're more likely to be experience post-trauma. And notice down at the bottom of the screen it talks about those with physical or learning disabilities, and ADHD kids, anxiety disorders, mental health issues. All those people are more likely to be more vulnerable than. That doesn't mean for sure that they're going to, and it doesn't mean people without that won't. But those are some of the keys. Okay, 3 types of post-traumatic stress reactions, and 3 categories basically. Re-experiencing, which are like flashbacks, and traumatic reminders. And we saw some of this, but I didn't see a whole lot of that. I don't know, Kara, for you, but I didn't see a lot of that. I had a couple middle schoolers that had a couple flashback experiences while watching movies, videos, that something would bring back. But most of what we saw were in the other 2 categories: avoidance and withdrawal reactions. People who, and you can imagine in a community where you have all these physical, where the environment changed so much, and so there's constant, reminders, visual reminders. They did, wanted to avoid. We saw kids change friend groups because their friends maybe they were with their friends when it happened, and they were, so they avoided them. We saw kids avoid doing the same activities that they did, before the tornado. Anything I think that would remind them of it. We did see a lot of avoidance, kind of, and withdrawal, social kind of withdrawal, and kind of, well, I guess I don't need to say it again, but a lot of avoidance and withdrawal reactions. And yeah, the last category I think was probably the biggest. Arousal with that reactions, being jumpy, irritable, anger.
Yeah.
In fact, that first sleep disorder, not being able to sleep or waking up from sleep.
Lots of worry, lots of anxiety over test anxiety, waking up in the morning, where their parents are, just really kind of
clingy behaviors with
and I'm thinking like my 3rd and 4th graders, stuff that was kind of more typical of like younger elementary students. We saw a lot of, and this would go back
memory
to memory
issues. It mentions there too, a lot of that.
The arousal reactions, having a trauma-trained staff really helped with those types of things instead of being very quick to, tell them, get back to your chair, get back to this, get doing whatever, really addressing those things with a lot more sensitivity.
Recognizing they may be.
Bells, the recess bell was a big issue at our building that first fall. Are we going to ring the recess bell? It sounds like a tornado siren. Are we going to do a fire? What if a fire drill happens? Those types of things had to be handled very differently.
Tornado drills, we had to
totally
consider those. So here are some school-specific signs. Cognitive problems, memory and learning problems, not being able to concentrate, a lot of survivor guilt, kids doing poorly on purpose because they were feeling guilty that they didn't, their house wasn't hit, and their friend was going through all this stuff, and a lot of emotional detachment. Saw a lot of that in middle schoolers. They would be doing the avoidance behaviors or the reaction things, with the anger and stuff, and then they'd be picking fights with kids, and then just flat affect afterwards, not feeling any remorse or any, and teachers were getting so frustrated with that. But the social withdrawn, aggressive, angry outbursts, a lot of high-risk behavior. Drug and alcohol abuse, huge at the high school and middle school. Lots, probably quadrupled cutting behaviors. Gary and I saw that in the middle school, high school, and suicidal stuff. A lot more suicidal ideation, huge increase in that stuff. Assessing for post, I'm going to skip this so we have time for questions, but there's a lot of information there. You need to continue to assess. Remember the 18 to 24 month thing, they can continue to show signs afterwards. So don't think that it's over, after the first month or 2. If they're not post-traumatic, they're out of the woods, because that's not the case. Here's an activity that we did. I can send you the rest. This is just a sample of it. But we did this a lot. I did this a lot, at least. And we did this from time to time. We did this in advisor-advisee, and we did this as a up on your feet, 4 corners activity type thing. And we'd read the question and have the kids go to the corner that best described their answer, posted the answers in the corners on signs, and it got the kids talking. They talked to each other about what had been going on with these questions. And I think the assessment activity has like 17, 18 questions on it. and it worked really well for us. So that's a possibility. Okay, here triggers, things that we talked about how the memory of the trauma is in there. Is in the body. It's in a sensory memory. So those are the things that trigger, sensory things are what trigger the memory then. So it's not going to be triggered by talking about it. It's not going to be triggered by the normal things. So you could have a kid sitting in class, and Kara mentioned the bell. The bell could trigger a kid to go into an episode, post-traumatic stress reaction. Any of these things could. If they were cooking hamburgers on the day of outside on the day of the event, and a smell of a grilled hamburger could trigger it. So that's an important thing to. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I just wanted to say this one tiny thing. I'll let you keep going, but I was thinking about the fact that our current kindergartners were toddlers when this happened. So a lot of them were developing their language, but they all had sensory memories. So sometimes we think that this is really going to only affect the kids that, could talk about it, they can remember it. But if you do look at the research, though, like our kindergartners, they may not have a conscious memory of the tornado, but they probably have it somewhere in their brain because they did have a sensory memory of it. And sometimes those little triggers, they may not be able to verbalize what's happening with them, but that is a possibility.
If those triggers really show, you have a kid just freak out at seemingly nothing. Think about what sensory thing just happened that could be. Here are some suggestions. I'm not going to go through these, but because it's a sensory related thing, you can't use verbal therapy with them. It won't work because it's not in their verbal memory. You got to use sensory kind of therapies with them, and there's some things listed down here. That any of the arts therapies, drawing is great. Sand tray is good. Drawing is good, but ways that they can communicate through the senses, and you can communicate with them through senses, and that's the stuff that works. But get training, because this is in an hour isn't going to do it. But you get the idea of why you need training, because it's just not your typical kind of situation. Here's some things you can do, educate, get a crisis team together. It doesn't go away on its own. It's not one of those things they're gonna get over it with time on their own. You gotta have trauma counseling to get over it. There's some good resources listed here, things you can do now. We ran out of time, but we have 3 minutes for questions. I guess that's not very much time, I'm afraid, but I really talked fast, but anyway.
So I don't know if Britt can ask questions to us, or I'll turn it over to you, Britt.
Okay. Well, we have 2 questions in the queue right now. Everyone else, if you still have questions, go ahead and feel free to type them in, and I will read them off to our panelists, and they can answer. First question. When you speak of trauma training, how do we go about finding this training, and who offers it?
Well, I just speak to what I got. I would say check the resources for what I put on there today. Where I got it is at the Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children, and that's one of the websites that I gave you today. The star something, I can't remember. Kara's looking it up here, but they have a training every summer in I think it's the 10th of July this year, 10th of July, 10 through 14 of July. But they also have a lot of online trainings, classes you can take there, and their online things are really good. startraining.org/TLC. That's the website that has that information. And
that TLC site also has just a ton of resources as far as like materials that you can use. I know, like coloring books and activities and art things and different ideas and stuff like that too. So not, they don't just offer just the training, but also materials that can be helpful.
Yeah. And if you can't find something, or you I, it wasn't clear enough, or you forgot something, just email me, kberry@cfu.net. It's on that last page, or Kara on the other side. We'll put our emails there. But that's where I went for training. It was excellent, and it's only 4 days too, which I think is pretty brief for to get.
Now, who was our speaker that came and talked to us?
Oh, William Steele.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the director of that.
I was going to say, because it is possible, if you are interested in having kind of a professional development for your district, that's what we ended up doing at the AP district, and that was really helpful for one of our PD days, was to get kind of a abbreviated version of the trauma training for everybody.
Yeah.
Okay, the last question we have. How did the trauma and crisis of the tornado prepare your counseling skills for the death of Coach Thomas?
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know if anything prepares you for that, but I was glad that we had, we knew about trauma. We knew what would, what worked and what didn't, and basically all the information that we just shared with you and then some. So, had we not known all that, we would have been, just totally in the dark.
I think it also served to kind of prepare parents in the community a little bit. I'm thinking specifically about the high school students who happened to be present in the weight room when that happened. Talk about a sensory experience.
Oh, wow.
But there were some really knowledgeable parents that had come to some of the, I know I'm thinking of a couple in particular that had kind of really asked a lot of questions about how to help their kids. They had kind of dug in, as far as things they could personally do when the tornado happened, and then when they knew kids that were in the weight room when that happened, they seemed to be able to kind of tread lightly around that, and they were able to, they had a lot more information as far as, how to go about that, ways to handle it. They were really protective, kind of their kids with, because they had that training too. So,
plus we had a lot more resources available. We knew where to go, and for information and for training and help.
And all that stuff that we talked about at the beginning too. Like, we did not go right into counselor mode at that time on that day. It was exactly what we talked about in that first part. Assess kind of your needs of right this minute. Go with what the town needs right now, and then at some point in the future you will do that other kinds of counseling. I think that's it.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, that will end the webinar. I want to thank Kathy and Kara for taking the time to put together this presentation and to share all of this great experience and information with the group. As a kind of housekeeping item, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered. We did record this webinar, so that will be available sometime either tomorrow or Monday, and then I'll send an email out to everyone with the link for that, as well as the PDF of the PowerPoint presentation that was shared today. And as you can see, Kathy and Kara's contact information is still listed on the screen, so if you have any other questions, I know that they're putting their information out there as a resource for crisis response questions. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Kathy and Kara, for sharing your knowledge and expertise.
You bet.
Thank you.